We all know that Dying Light 2's physics and ragdolls are subpar compared to Dying Light 1. However, I don't see many people talking specifically on how the physics in Dying Light 2 can actually be fixed. So, in this video, I'm going to compare both games' physics and point out some oddly specific details which makes Dying Light 1's physics feel much more satisfying and rewarding, unlike how it currently is in Dying Light 2. I will present my points from how I feel is least important to the most important. So, let's do it. In Dying Light 2, enemies seem to play one of 4 animations depending on what side you throw the propane tank at them. And funnily enough, the enemy will play the same animation that the enemy, or at least virals and biters I know for sure, play when you perform the air kick skill in them. My question is, why not just ragdoll them on impact of the propane tank and calculate the force of how far the enemy will be pushed over? Just like how it is in the first game. I believe the viral ragdolled here as he collided with that wall during that animation he plays. And here you can see that the animation that plays is identical to the one that plays doing the air kick skill, just as I mentioned. Here the biter performs the animation and collides with another one, causing it to ragdoll. However, if the animation was replaced by a simple ragdoll, then couldn't the same system introducing their gut feeling update, where ragdolled zombies make surrounding zombies ragdoll too, be applied here? In Dying Light 1, enemies ragdoll immediately on impact of the thrown propane tank. It can even be used to precisely and satisfyingly push the enemies into spike traps. This gives the player a more rewarding opportunity to smartly outplay the enemies. This section was inspired by a video by Doc on Holiday, who enabled this feature in one of his mods. Although this is an older video in the early days of Dying Light 2, you can still see in his video that enemies ragdoll on impact of the thrown propane tank, and it looks 10 times better than what we have now. I'll show it now.
You can see that the physics system comes in and knocks them all the way to the ground. If you hit them in the legs, it will also knock them down, just like in the original game.
I'd like to mention this topic because I personally count this as a physics thing, but also because it makes the game much more immersive, seeing the effects of your weapons in game. During my tests, none of my shock knives or regular throw knives stuck in the enemies. However, the explosives knives do until they explode, which is honestly extremely funny to watch. In Dying Light 1, the same problem arises. None of my throwing knives stuck in the enemies. However, sequels are always meant to be better than their originals, so Dying Light 2 should definitely add this. Now, in Dying Light 2, arrows will either go through enemies and stick to the surface behind them, completely disappear, or in a very low chance, stick it to enemies. I think the chance of the arrows sticking should be heavily increased, because I cannot stand the arrows vanishing from thin air. This is exactly the same for crossbow bolts as well, and also unfortunately throwing spears. I say unfortunately because I recently played the 1.0 version of the game, and was surprised to see my spear stick into the enemy, and I was shocked. It may not seem like a terribly big difference, but the difference is massive. And unfortunately I don't have any footage of this, so you'll just have to take my word. In Dying Light 1, the chance of sticking is massively increased, and seems to be guaranteed on a killing blow, as well as the arrows and bolts appearing much larger than in Dying Light 2, which makes it more satisfying and obvious that the player can retrieve them. I believe all this to be the same for crossbows, but I've barely played Dying Light 1 on Steam, and I haven't got to the following yet to record any footage. The problem with arrows in these two games is essentially the same for throwing any bladed weapon. Dying Light 2 has a lower chance of sticking, and Dying Light 1 is almost 100% of the time. However, when throwing a weapon in Dying Light 1, it stuns the enemy, allowing you to perform a finisher on them. So I think it could be a feature in Dying Light 2, unless this is one of the few gameplay changes between Aiden and Crane, in which case, I'm fine with that. When being kicked in Dying Light 2, enemies can usually take the same combo of 3 kicks straight until they perform an ugly looking animation into a ragdoll. Instead of using an animation for that, why not just use a ragdoll and apply some force to it? Why make it so when kicking enemies you get the same experience of watching the same animations play out? It always feels the same in Dying Light 2, but replacing the animation with a ragdoll would give some variation, since anything can happen in a physics scenario. Also, when kicking an enemy into a wall, they will usually play an animation of them bouncing off the wall into a ragdoll. Why even have that animation in the first place? A ragdoll would do that already for you, and that is exactly what happens in Dying Light 1. You can see this in the few examples I'm going to show. However, I found that zombies will not ragdoll against walls in this animation that occurs when you kick them from behind, as seen on screen. Unlike Dying Light 1, there is a severe lack of breakable objects for the player and enemies to fall into and break. No breakable roofs and a lack of breakable boxes, although they do exist in Dying Light 2. It adds a lot of immersion for the atmosphere of the world. Although there is a lack of physical objects in the environment of Dying Light 2, I discovered in the tower raid mode that these hanging speakers can be shot down and physically moved around, which made me happy and excited for this aspect in Dying Light the Beast, especially as this is something that's shown in the new trailer with the breakable shelves. We are now getting into my final points, and this is where it gets a lot harder for me to explain these more important things. I want to start this specific section by recommending you watch this video by AussieGG. Although most of his examples from this criticism have been fixed in present Dying Light 2, there is still the same problem of the game's huge preference towards animations rather than physics, where I think people tend not to notice. However, it is definitely where the root problem of most people's problem with the physics lie. I'm going to give some examples of this now. Here you can see a viral is in its burning animation, and you can clearly see it ragdolls. However, because this other viral is in its attack animation, as well as its run animation, it isn't allowed to ragdoll off the building, even though both of his feet are clearly hovering mid-air, so he should be falling. You can very obviously see it here too. I'd also like to add that virals can't ragdoll in their dodge animation, seen here. Also, neither volatiles or virals can ragdoll in their UV light animations. All these things just shown are much better in Dying Light 1. The viral does his dodge animation and is allowed to ragdoll because he dodged a bit too far off the building. Virals can perform their attack and run animations, and if they go off the building, they are allowed to ragdoll. It almost feels like in this game, enemies are always able to ragdoll no matter the animation they're in, unlike Dying Light 2. See that volatiles and nightwalkers can ragdoll during their UV light animation here. And it's even worse for biters. Yes, the main and most common enemy in the perfect physics environment. They just don't have the ability to ragdoll in their walking or attack animations. And they just don't try as much as in Dying Light 1 to try getting to you no matter what. But we'll get into that a bit later. It is much better in Dying Light 1. Watch how this biter will stumble at you, even if it means stepping off a building and realizing it needs to ragdoll. Doing power attacks with your fist in Dying Light 1 is so satisfying. The impact, the animation, although I can't get too far into that, I'll save it for a combat video I'd like to do in the future. But when being hit with a charged punch, the enemy will stumble into objects and ragdoll, or will ragdoll on slanted roofs and fall to their death. It's perfect, and unfortunately, it isn't like this in Dying Light 2, so hopefully Crane's crazy punches will return in Dying Light the Beast. Just something quick I want to show is this biter animation when you use the power attack on them. If you hit them during their recovery animation while on the floor, they will ragdoll. This is perfect, but unfortunately this is not the same for virals seen here, as well as probably many other different animations across the game. But ragdolls in these animations are very satisfying and improve the physical flow of combat instead of strange, unrealistic animation switches. I'm going to show you some clips from each of the games, and please tell me that you can notice the difference between the two of them. Dying Light 2 forces enemies into an animation when moving down a limited, safe height from surfaces, meaning this animation prevents them from jumping down heights that are not so safe for them, and would make them look silly if this animation is still used. This makes the zombies feel smart, but unfortunately that only makes them way less fun. However, Dying Light 1 places the biter in an animation too, but this short animation places them in the perfect position to ragdoll. The ragdoll allows them to jump off any height, no matter how tall it is, whether it is a small step or a building. They even thought of an animation when vaulting a waist-high object, and make them ragdoll coming down the other side. This small feature makes all the difference, and it must return in Dying Light 2, especially because the verticality of the game is perfect for this. To give an example, imagine making lots of noise and having enemies fall down from buildings above as if it was raining. It's the perfect opportunity, but unfortunately it just doesn't happen. Although this video is critical, I would like to acknowledge the amount of work that has been put into the physics since launch, since it actually has come a seriously long way. It really is slowly getting better each update, but I just hope that this video in particular can help Techland to improve the physics in this game up to the high standard of Dying Light 1. An example of me being surprised by the sequel's physics was when I wanted to add a suggestion to make volatiles and virals full when climbing and exposed to UV light. But this was already a feature, so I was completely wrong. I don't know if this was here since launch or added in a later update. Either way, it's a good feature and I'm glad a developer thought of it since it just makes sense. The beast looks less vertical than the sequel, which is good because it essentially hides the flaws that the sequel has with its current physics. And the game looks absolutely stunning, so much more atmospheric than Dying Light 2. However, the actual physics, or at least collisions, look better in Dying Light the Beast, although people say otherwise. At least from this comparison here, I think the collisions of the Ragdoll look better and less glitchy than the second game. So, apparently there are new Dying Light games in the works. Although very unlikely, I beg that one of them is a Dying Light VR game. VR is becoming more and more accessible as time goes on, and a Dying Light VR game could be one of the new frontrunners of big franchises making VR games, like the new Metro Awakening game. If it had the physical combat from VR games like Blade and Sorcery, it would fit since the flat screen games have physical combat too, obviously. As well as the smooth parkour from Stride Fates or the new Assassin's Creed VR game. Also, the environments and atmosphere of Dying Light 1. It could be the greatest games on the VR platform. Plus I know Dying Light 1 had an experimental VR mode, so the devs must have been intrigued by it. I don't have much to say here, but I would like to say I personally don't think it's the fault of the engine, despite what most people say. Because although I know different engines have their pros and cons, but if Dying Light 2 was made in Unreal Engine, then it wouldn't be the fault of the engine, but simply the design, and what I've shown in this video. The engine they are using is perfectly capable of this stuff. Hell, they made Dying Light 2 in it, and also making Dying Light the Beast in it too. So with that being said, Thank you for watching. Liking and subscribing would be very appreciated, especially because I have more Dying Light 2 videos on the way, just like this one, right here. My final message to Techland: don't be afraid to use Ragdolls.